Roger, in previous videos, we were looking at Shakespeare's sonnets on the chart you have here on your lounge wall, and you were explaining the structure and how intentional it is. And of course, the most important thing is the philosophy and the meaning of the sonnets. But you're going to continue looking at the structure, and you're preparing us for that, to understand Shakespeare's philosophy. So what have you got for us today?
So we have indicated that there is a significant structure intentionally embedded in the sonnets by Shakespeare, and have begun to explain some of those elements. But we've also been talking about some of the other details in the sonnets that show there's incredible intentionality on Shakespeare's part in terms of structuring the set of sonnets before he published them in 1609. So if we look at the set, and we again remind ourselves that the whole set is based in nature, that the 154 sonnets represent nature, that there's 28 sonnets to the female or the mistress and 126 sonnets to the male. There's a set of increased sonnets in the male sequence and sonnets that deal with truth and beauty, and there's a division in the female sequence between the sonnets that deal with beauty alone and then with truth. And these are the main components of Shakespeare's philosophy. And I think it's important to remind ourselves, or to remember, that we're going to come back to those components. So what we're going to show you is a couple of templates that I've derived over time and are now published in our works, that look and show you how the various components, the male and the female, and nature and increase in the male and female again, and then truth and beauty, and the way in which the mind works, how the body relates to the mind, how that's obviously embedded in Shakespeare's sonnets, and how that relates to a philosophy based in nature. And so we have two templates which we're going to show you before we move on now to talk about some of the details, again, that show that amazing intentionality on Shakespeare's part to present not only a major philosophy, but a philosophy that relates to a number of aspects of our lives and our way in which we understand things.
Roger, I appreciate that the philosophical structuring of the sonnets is most important, but in this session, you're also going to demonstrate the importance of things like time and music and the muse. Can you demonstrate that? Can you elaborate?
Sure. Well, if we take, for instance, even the number of increased sonnets from 1 to 14, so we go from 1 to 14, what we find, if we divide that number 14 into 154, it goes in evenly and we get the number 11. And number 11 in numerological terms is unity, the 1 plus 1, so it's a double unity, so it's a confirmation of unity. So there we have just the basic thing, like the increase argument, the 14 sonnets that present the increase argument, multiply into the whole set, which is a bit of a pun in its own right. And if we look at things like music, for instance, in the sonnets, we find that the sonnet 8 is a music sonnet. It mentions music twice, which is sonnet 8, which is here in the increase section, and sonnet 128, which is at the beginning of the mistress sequence, mentions music twice. And what we find is a pattern of 8s in the set. And because 8 notes or 8 beats is a natural octave, Shakespeare's pattern for the music in the set goes from the beginning of the set to the end of the set, from sonnet 1 to sonnet 154. But if we look at time in the sequence, and we note, for instance, that sonnet 12 mentions hour and sonnet 60 mentions minutes, and here's Shakespeare using the sonnets to present other ideas besides his principal ideas, we find that every sonnet after sonnet 10 begins at the top of a page, and there's 12 sets of 12, but the pattern for time begins within the set and finishes before the end of the set. So time, especially in terms of hours and minutes or weeks, is a construct, a human construct, a mental construct. And of course we have the natural progression of a day, or the lunar month, for instance, or the passage of a year in which, of course, the earth goes around the sun. So they're natural time intervals, whereas what Shakespeare's differentiating is our capacity to invent time sequences like the minute and the hour for our own purposes. In fact, concepts like zero and infinity, just throwing this in, are totally human constructs which have no parallel or no correlate in the natural world. And of course, people do attempt to make them, like the notion of God, for instance, as if somehow they are embedded in the world, but they're not. They're just human constructs that were invented about 300 or 400 years ago for purposes of computation. So there's other components as well. Like, for instance, there's a muse is mentioned throughout the sequence. Well, that's not true. A muse is only mentioned in the youth sequence, quite frequently in the rival or the alien poet sonnets. And the muse is a personification of the notion of truth. So Shakespeare is using metaphor in a way to actually extend his capacity to be able to explain to people what he's talking about. And then the word rose is mentioned throughout the sequence, and the rose is a metaphor for the notion of beauty. And so you have the mistress and the master mistress, you have nature, but you have these other components that add colour and depth to Shakespeare's expression and understanding and his capacity to reach out to people and to get people to understand what he's on about.
Roger, when you read and peruse the sonnets, the connections, and some of the sonnets seem quite argumentative. Your thoughts?
Well, Shakespeare has deliberately chosen the sonnet as a vehicle for his philosophy. I mean, it's a very common poetic device used for various reasons in Shakespeare's day. But Shakespeare takes it to another level. And so what you find in a sonnet, for instance, there's quite frequently a premise or a thesis, and then an antithesis, and then a conclusion. So the first 3 quatrains, the first 12 lines, present the argument of the sonnet, and then the couplet usually has an ironic rejoinder or some comment on the previous content. There's even sonnets that are organised together. So some sonnets are connected with a but, some sonnets with a thus or a so. And so there's this very strong argumentative strain that runs through the sonnets. And in fact, there's 3 sonnets at one point that run with a thus, a so, and a but, for instance. And so there's a very intentional process. So for instance, if we compare Shakespeare's sonnets to Dante's Divine Comedy, if I can do that, and he has 100 cantos, not 124, but 100 cantos, because his are about the divine unity. And what you find, there's an introductory canto, and then 3 sets of cantos, each with 33 in them. And one of them is hell, the next one's purgatory, and the other one's paradise. And these are all mind-based constructs. And so he uses his cantos to advance his fantasy understanding of the way in which we picture ourselves in relationship to the world, whereas Shakespeare uses his sonnets to argue his case for the relationship between nature, the female and the male, and how we use our understanding in terms of truth and beauty to better understand the world and to better express ourselves.
So clearly Shakespeare's 1609 sonnets, the structure is important and the order is important.
Yes, I've mentioned this before, and it's worth reiterating again and again, really, because unless you respect the original edition of the sonnets, the way in which they've been arranged, and listen to the wording of the sonnets, don't change out the wordings, no emendations at all, you'll get closer to understanding Shakespeare's philosophy. Not only that, once you understand the philosophy, then you have the key that he provides to understand all his plays. What you find, in fact, in the reception of Shakespeare over the last 400 years, there's been all sorts of excuses and reasons for changing the plays, for considering him to be, for instance, an idiot savant who needs someone else to interpret what he's on about, or that people can change out anything that he said because he's a businessman or something else like that. So people come up with all sorts of reasons to change out Shakespeare's works. But there's absolutely no reason to change out his works. Based on the sonnets and looking at the plays as the expression of the sonnet philosophy, then that's the way in which to better understand what Shakespeare intended, and not only that, to have a really good understanding of a nature-based philosophy, which is really, really significant at this time in history when we're becoming more and more aware of the significance of nature in our lives.